The CNN studio lights shone brightly over what was supposed to be a standard legal debate on presidential powers. Instead, viewers were about to witness one of the most astonishing confrontations in recent television history. Alan Dershowitz, the renowned Harvard law professor and longtime defender of controversial public figures, sat across from Representative Jasmine Crockett, a former civil rights attorney now serving her second term in Congress. The topic was executive privilege and its limits in criminal investigations. From the very first moments, the tension was palpable. Dershowitz, with his trademark confidence, launched into an explanation of why presidents deserve certain legal protections. His voice carried the authority of someone who had been teaching constitutional law for more than 50 years. But as Crockett attempted to respond, Dershowitz cut her off immediately. "With all due respect, Congresswoman," he said dismissively, waving his hand, "this is a complex constitutional matter that requires decades of legal scholarship to fully grasp. Perhaps we should stick to the basics here." The condescension was unmistakable. The camera captured a flicker in Crockett's eyes. Not anger, but calm, measured determination. What followed stunned the studio. Crockett posed a single question, precise and devastatingly effective, that left Dershowitz, renowned for his rapid-fire rebuttals, momentarily speechless. For the first time in his decades-long media career, the famed legal scholar was silent on live television. Behind the scenes, production assistants exchanged stunned glances. That moment would soon become one of the most widely circulated clips in legal and political social media, highlighting a fundamental shift. Even the most established experts can be held accountable for the consistency of their arguments. Alan Dershowitz, at 85, had long been considered America's foremost legal mind. For over half a century, he had been a fixture at Harvard Law School and on television screens nationwide. His client list read like a roster of the most controversial figures of the era, from O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump during his first impeachment trial. Known for his lightning-quick mind and unwavering confidence, Dershowitz had written dozens of books and argued numerous cases before the Supreme Court. What made him particularly formidable was his ability to frame even the most contentious positions as reasonable interpretations of the Constitution. His frequent television appearances had made him a household name. His speaking style, rapid, authoritative, and peppered with references to his own credentials, was instantly recognizable. "I've been teaching constitutional law at Harvard for 50 years" was a phrase viewers had heard countless times. Was often used to shut down opposing arguments. Behind this persona was a brilliant legal mind who genuinely believed in certain constitutional principles even when they led to unpopular conclusions. Yet critics increasingly accused him of selective interpretation and applying strict constitutional standards for some clients while relaxing them for others. This perceived inconsistency had tarnished his once unassailable reputation, though his confidence remained intact. Facing him was Representative Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th Congressional District. In just her second term, she had already established herself as a formidable voice on constitutional law and civil rights. Before entering politics, Crockett had built an impressive career as a civil rights attorney in Texas. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she handled high-profile cases involving voting rights, police misconduct, and criminal justice reform. Her most notable legal victory came in a landmark case challenging discriminatory bail practices, which led to reforms across several states. Unlike many politicians with limited legal backgrounds, Crockett approached Congress with the precision and evidence-based methodology of a seasoned trial lawyer. She earned a reputation for being meticulously prepared and unfazed under pressure, qualities that served her well, both in the courtroom and in congressional hearings. "I don't come to these discussions to perform," she once told a reporter. "I come to get to the truth, and sometimes that requires cutting through a lot of noise." The CNN debate that brought these two figures together focused on a recent Supreme Court ruling regarding executive privilege, specifically whether former presidents could continue to assert such privileges after leaving office. Dershowitz had publicly defended a broad view of these powers, arguing they extended well beyond a president's term. The stakes were high for both participants. For Dershowitz, it was a chance to reaffirm his relevance after several years of controversy had tarnished his standing. For Crockett, it was an opportunity to challenge constitutional interpretations she viewed as dangerous to the rule of law. The studio was set up in CNN's standard debate format. The participants seated across from each other at a sleek desk with Anderson Cooper moderating. The red and blue backdrop created a formal atmosphere suitable for a constitutional discussion. Behind the scenes, the production team expected a spirited but routine debate. Dershowitz was a network regular known for provocative yet telegenic arguments. Crockett, while rising in prominence, was confronting someone of Dershowitz's stature for the first time. Tonight, we're discussing the limits of executive privilege following the Supreme Court's recent ruling, Cooper began. Professor Dershowitz, you've taken a position that many constitutional scholars have questioned. Could you explain your reasoning? Dershowitz nodded confidently. Certainly, Anderson. Having taught at Harvard Law for 5 decades, I've seen that executive privilege serves a crucial function in our constitutional system. The recent ruling doesn't fully account for the historical context in which these protections developed. He spoke for nearly 2 uninterrupted minutes, citing historical precedents and legal theory, frequently reminding viewers of his extensive experience. The camera occasionally cut to Crockett, who listened intently, making notes. Congresswoman Crockett, your response? Cooper asked. Thank you, Anderson. Crockett began. While I respect Professor Dershowitz's long career, we need to distinguish between. If I might clarify something, Dershowitz interrupted, raising a finger. The Congresswoman is relatively new to these constitutional questions, and a fundamental principle is being overlooked here. Cooper intervened. Professor, please allow her to finish. Of course, Dershowitz said, though impatience lingered in his expression. Crockett began again outlining her interpretation of the Supreme Court ruling. She cited specific passages from the majority opinion and explained how they aligned with precedent. Her analysis was precise, structured, and grounded in both legal history and practical implications. As she spoke, Dershowitz shook his head, visibly increasingly dismissive. That's simply not correct, he interrupted with all respect. Congresswoman, I've argued before the Supreme Court on precisely these issues. The fundamental misunderstanding here is Professor Cooper interjected firmly. Please allow Representative Crockett to finish. From the control room, the executive producer leaned forward with interest. The usual pattern in these debates involved the more experienced commentator, dominating through interruption and appeals to authority. But Crockett's calm, methodical responses, coupled with Cooper's moderation, were creating an unusual dynamic. Let me put this simply, Dershowitz continued, visibly frustrated. Executive privilege, as I've taught to thousands of students over 5 decades at Harvard, is Crockett was undeterred, attempting to engage with the substance of the constitutional argument. Dershowitz repeatedly interrupted, citing his credentials. Yet Crockett remained composed, methodical, and unflappable. Congresswoman Dershowitz said after a particularly detailed response regarding the recent ruling's limitations. These are nuanced legal concepts that often confuse even experienced attorneys. Perhaps I can simplify this for your benefit and for the viewers. The camera caught a subtle shift in Crockett's expression. Not anger, but clinical focus, like evaluating a witness who had just slipped. Anderson, she said calmly, I'd like to respond to that. Please do, Cooper replied, sensing the tension building. Professor Dershowitz, Crockett began. You've referenced your Harvard position 7 times in the past 6 minutes. You've mentioned arguing before the Supreme Court 4 times. Yet, you haven't addressed the specific language in Chief Justice Roberts' opinion that contradicts your position. Understanding principles is one thing. Applying them consistently is another. The small audience of legal journalists and guests exchanged glances. One constitutional law professor leaned toward a colleague and murmured, She's setting him up perfectly. What exactly are you implying, Congresswoman? Dershowitz asked, his tone sharpening. I'm not implying anything, Crockett replied. I'm stating that your interpretation of executive privilege seems to shift depending on who is asserting it. Dershowitz's face flushed. That's absolutely false. My entire career has been defined by principle, not partisanship. I appreciate that assertion, Crockett responded calm but pointed. But perhaps we should examine the record. She reached for a folder on the desk. In 2018, you argued on this very network that a sitting president cannot be indicted or investigated because it would impair his ability to function. Correct. Yes, Dershowitz replied immediately. Yet in 1998, Crockett continued, you argued the exact opposite regarding a different president, stating, no one is above the law, and a president cannot impede investigations into his conduct. Dershowitz shifted in his seat. The situations were entirely different. Different politically, certainly, Crockett interjected, but constitutionally the same principles should apply, shouldn't they? Professor, the control room producer, spoke into his headset. Stay on them. This is gold. Dershowitz, sensing the line of questioning was becoming uncomfortable, attempted to regain control. Congresswoman, you're taking my statements out of context. Constitutional interpretation requires understanding the specific circumstances of each case. He said, his tone slightly defensive. I agree completely, Crockett replied. Context matters, so let's be specific about the context. She turned to another page in her folder. In 2020, you stated that abuse of power is not an impeachable offense because it isn't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Yet in this book, she held up a copy of one of Dershowitz's earlier works. You wrote that criminal-like conduct is sufficient grounds for impeachment, even if it doesn't violate specific statutes. The studio had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the floor director seemed frozen in place, aware they were witnessing something unexpected. Cooper hesitated before speaking, letting the moment breathe. Dershowitz, who normally delivered his rapid authoritative rebuttals without pause, found himself at a rare disadvantage. His usual confidence faltered as Crockett systematically presented evidence of contradictions spanning decades. Those positions can be reconciled through proper constitutional analysis. Dershowitz insisted, though, the rapid cadence of his speech had slowed. I'd be very interested to hear that reconciliation. Crockett said, her voice calm but unwavering. Because to many observers, including numerous constitutional scholars, these positions seem influenced more by the political affiliation of the president involved than by consistent constitutional principles. Dershowitz's expression hardened. That's an unfair characterization of my work. I've spent my entire career defending constitutional principles regardless of politics, he said. With respect, Professor Tant Crockett replied, that claim needs to be examined against the record. She flipped to a third page in her folder. In 2020, you defended the idea that a president could pardon himself, calling it constitutional. Yet, in 1974, you wrote an article stating that self-pardons would undermine the Constitution. The camera caught Dershowitz's expression, a mix of irritation and growing unease. The script had clearly shifted. Guests typically deferred to his authority or became defensive, but Crockett was doing neither. She methodically presented contradictions with calm, almost clinical precision. For the first time in decades, Dershowitz found himself on the defensive with no clear recourse to his usual tactics. The tension in the studio was palpable. Cooper glanced at the producer off camera, signaling that the exchange should continue uninterrupted. This was rare television, an intellectual confrontation exposing not just disagreement, but accountability in public legal discourse. The Congresswoman is engaging in personal attacks rather than addressing the substance of my arguments. Dershowitz tried to redirect his voice, rising slightly. I am citing your own words, Professor Crockett replied evenly. Examining your statements for consistency isn't a personal attack. It's about evaluating the foundations of those arguments. She deliberately closed her folder and looked directly at him. The studio went silent as she prepared to deliver the question that would leave Dershowitz speechless. She had carefully built to this moment throughout the debate. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward slightly, her expression focused and calm. Professor Dershowitz, she began, her voice steady. After 50 years of teaching constitutional law, which should the American people believe your constitutional interpretation when it benefits Republicans or your contradictory interpretation when it benefits Democrats? The simplicity and directness of the question hung in the air. For a moment, the entire studio seemed frozen. Cooper's eyebrows raised, acknowledging the precision of the question. Dershowitz, who had rarely been without words, opened his mouth and then closed it again. Several excruciating seconds passed an eternity on live television. The cameras captured every nuance. The widening of his eyes, the faint parting of his lips, the subtle flush on his cheeks. Here was one of America's most prominent legal minds, known for never being silenced completely without a response. In the control room, the executive producer whispered urgently, "Stay on him. Don't cut away." They recognized they were witnessing a historic television moment. When Dershowitz finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual authority. That's an unfair characterization of my work," he stammered. "My interpretations are based on constitutional principles, not partisan considerations." But the damage was done. His hesitation had been visible to millions of viewers, and the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Crockett did not press immediately. She allowed the moment to breathe, a technique she had perfected in courtrooms when witnesses had just undermined themselves. "With respect, Professor," she finally said, "I didn't ask about your intentions. I asked which of your contradictory interpretations the American people should believe, because they can't both be correct." Cooper sensed the gravity of the moment and intervened carefully. "Professor Dershowitz, would you like to respond directly to the Congresswoman's question?" Dershowitz attempted to regain footing. "Constitutional interpretation evolves over time. My thinking develops as I analyze precedents and historical context more deeply," he said. "Interesting," Crockett observed, "but it doesn't explain why your evolution consistently aligns with the political interests of whoever you are defending at the time." She turned toward the camera, addressing viewers directly. "This isn't about Professor Dershowitz personally. It's about the integrity of our constitutional discourse. When legal authorities present partisan preferences as neutral constitutional interpretation, it undermines the rule of law." Journalists behind the cameras typed furiously. One whispered, "She just did what 100 interviewers have failed to do. Expose the fundamental contradiction without making it personal." Dershowitz attempted another deflection. "The Congresswoman is playing to the cameras rather than engaging with serious constitutional questions," he said. "I am citing your own published statements, Professor," Crockett replied evenly. "If that's playing to the cameras, the issue is with the inconsistency of those statements, not with my question." The production team reacted subtly, raised eyebrows, barely suppressed smiles. Even Cooper's professional neutrality showed a flicker of admiration for Crockett's approach. "My interpretations of executive privilege and presidential power are based on decades of scholarship," Dershowitz said, trying to reassert his authority. "Perhaps," Crockett acknowledged, "but it doesn't address the fundamental problem your interpretations have repeatedly reversed, depending on which political party benefits." "That isn't scholarship. It's advocacy masquerading as analysis." She opened her folder again. "When you wrote in 1998 that obstruction of justice was impeachable, and then argued in 2019 that it wasn't, you weren't advancing constitutional understanding. You were adapting your position to defend different clients. Those situations were contextually distinct," Dershowitz insisted, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "The only consistent distinction," Crockett said, "is the president's party affiliation." She closed the folder deliberately. "Professor, I respect your career and contributions, but evolving one's views through deeper understanding is different from adopting whatever interpretation serves your client at the moment." Dershowitz's face flushed. "You're oversimplifying complex questions." "No," Professor Crockett interrupted firmly. "I'm asking a simple question about a decades-long pattern. Your inability to answer speaks volumes." The control room debated whether to extend the segment. This was riveting television, but also considered ending it to spare Dershowitz further embarrassment. He attempted one last appeal to authority. "Congresswoman, I've spent 50 years teaching constitutional law at Harvard. I've argued more Supreme Court cases than you've likely read. Viewers understand who has the deeper knowledge." She responded calmly without rising to the bait. "I'm not questioning your credentials. I'm questioning the consistency of your interpretations. Appeals to authority are not answers to legitimate questions about consistency." She turned slightly toward Cooper. Anderson noticed that when confronted with decades of contradictory statements, Professor Dershowitz responds not by reconciling them, but by reminding us of his resume. Cooper followed up, recognizing the moment's importance. Professor Dershowitz, how would you address the specific contradictions the Congresswoman has identified? Dershowitz began a prepared statement about constitutional complexity. Crockett interrupted gently. Anderson, let me be specific. This isn't about theory. It's about a principle that should guide all constitutional discourse consistency. She looked directly at Dershowitz. When you tell Americans that a sitting president is immune from investigation in 2019, but argued the opposite in 1998, you're not advancing constitutional understanding. You're using your authority to provide cover for partisan positions. The clarity of her framing left Dershowitz with few options. He couldn't deny his previous statements they were public record. He couldn't claim a coincidental evolution perfectly aligned with partisan interests. And he couldn't dismiss Crockett as uninformed. She commanded both his work and constitutional principles. The American people deserve better. Crockett continued addressing viewers. They deserve experts who apply the same standards regardless of who is in power. Analysis based on principle, not partisanship. Honesty about when interpretation ends and advocacy begins. The studio was silent. Even the production team, usually bustling, remained still. They were witnessing an unprecedented challenge, not just to Dershowitz's arguments, but to an entire approach to constitutional commentary on cable news. Dershowitz, visibly uneasy, looked toward Cooper with a pleading expression. Cooper, recognizing the moment's significance, asked, Professor, would you like to respond directly to the Congresswoman about consistency and interpretation? I've always followed the Constitution, Dershowitz insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Different circumstances require different applications of principles. That would be reasonable, Crockett acknowledged, if differences align with facts, not political beneficiaries. The American people can recognize when principles are consistent and when they're manipulated. They deserve experts who respect that intelligence. Cooper sensed the exchange had reached its natural conclusion. Dershowitz had been given multiple opportunities to reconcile his contradictions, and had failed. We need to take a break, Cooper said. Professor Dershowitz, Congresswoman Crockett, thank you for this illuminating discussion. As the camera prepared to cut, Crockett added a final note. This isn't about Professor Dershowitz or me. It's about whether society demands consistent principles from legal authorities regardless of partisan advantage. The Constitution deserves that respect, even when conclusions are politically inconvenient. The camera caught Dershowitz's expression, a mix of frustration and grudging respect. As the segment ended, for perhaps the first time in decades, he had been rendered speechless, not by personal attacks, but by the devastating clarity of his own contradictory statements presented calmly and precisely. In the control room, producers reviewed the footage, aware they had witnessed something remarkable. A standard legal debate transformed into a masterclass in accountability, demonstrating how to challenge authority with evidence and principle rather than rhetoric or personal attacks. The aftermath of the Crockett-Dershowitz confrontation extended far beyond the CNN studio. Within hours, clips of the exchange had flooded social media platforms, racking up millions of views and thousands of comments. What set this moment apart wasn't merely the dramatic on-air silence of a prominent legal figure, but the methodical, respectful way. Crockett had exposed decades of contradictions in Dershowitz's constitutional interpretations. Law students and legal educators alike recognized it as an educational goldmine. At Harvard Law School, where Dershowitz had taught for nearly 50 years, professors reported students actively debating the exchange. One constitutional law professor told the Harvard Crimson, this confrontation has sparked more substantive discussion about consistency and legal interpretation than anything I've seen in years. Students dissected the quotes, comparing them across decades, analyzing whether principles had been applied consistently or selectively. The debate became a case study in the ethics of legal commentary. Across the media spectrum, analysts took notice. MSNBC commentator Rachel Maddow described it as a masterclass in challenging authority without personal attacks. Conservative commentator Andrew McCarthy at the National Review acknowledged, regardless of one's politics, Congresswoman Crockett's approach to questioning inconsistency should be a model for substantive debate than social media users engaged in unusually thoughtful discussion, sharing clips and examples of other public figures who had reversed positions depending on political alignment. Crockett's national profile surged overnight. Her office received thousands of emails within 48 hours, not only from supporters, but from Americans across the political spectrum, impressed by her meticulous, principled approach. One email from a conservative lawyer in Ohio read, "I deeply disagree with your politics, but your commitment to constitutional consistency transcends partisanship. We need more of that kind of intellectual honesty." Law students were especially inspired. Membership in constitutional law societies skyrocketed, and applications for Crockett's congressional internship program tripled. A Yale law student told The Washington Post, "Watching that exchange reminded me why I wanted to study law, not to win arguments, but to uphold principles consistently." Across the country, law schools incorporated the exchange into curricula, analyzing the balance between advocacy ethics and interpretation. For Dershowitz, the aftermath was more complicated. Initially, some supporters defended him, arguing that Crockett had taken his statements out of context. But as the full exchange circulated, including the moments where he failed to reconcile contradictory positions, even longtime admirers began questioning his approach. His reputation as the unquestioned authority of cable news commentary shifted subtly. Network hosts no longer relied solely on his credentials as proof of expertise. They began asking pointed questions about consistency and past positions, expecting substantive answers rather than appeals to authority. Media training companies incorporated the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange into their courses. Crisis communications expert Jennifer Martinez explained in a viral LinkedIn post. "Notice how Representative Crockett never raised her voice, never personalized her critique, and always returned to documented statements." That's a model of effective evidence-based accountability. The exchange influenced not only media training, but legal education itself. Columbia, Georgetown, and Yale introduced modules on professional ethics and the responsibility of commentators to maintain consistent principles. Professor Maria Gonzalez at Georgetown reported her enrollment in ethics courses had doubled, noting students' fascination with the tension between advocacy and honest analysis. Several legal commentators began proactively addressing potential contradictions since in their own statements, publishing clarifications, and reconciling evolving views. Network executives faced pressure to highlight inconsistencies in expert commentary more rigorously. CNN's internal analytics revealed the Crockett-Dershowitz segment had drawn more engagement than any other legal discussion in the network's history, suggesting viewers were hungry for substantive accountability rather than performative conflict. Digital media analyst Jennifer Patel explained, "For decades, viewers were assumed to want confrontational, sensational content, but this data indicates a strong appetite for principled evidence-based discourse." 3 weeks after the interview, Dershowitz, who rarely acknowledged criticism, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled "Constitutional Consistency in the Evolution of Legal Thought." Recent public discourse has raised legitimate questions about consistency and constitutional interpretation, he wrote. "While I stand by my analyses in each case, I acknowledge that personal and political factors can influence even the most objective legal mind. A lifelong commitment to the Constitution requires constant self-examination to ensure principles, not preferences, guide our interpretations." The op-ed was an unprecedented concession for a figure known for unyielding defense of his positions. Subsequent appearances by Dershowitz reflected a subtle change. He acknowledged tensions between past and present positions more openly and offered substantive reconciliations rather than dismissing contradictions outright. Academic researchers seized the viral exchange as a case study in legal ethics and public discourse. Yale Law's professor James Wilson incorporated the full interview into his professional responsibility curriculum, telling students, "This interaction demonstrates how accountability and legal commentary can be achieved without descending into personal attacks or partisan finger-pointing." Journalism schools also took note. Columbia's School of Journalism launched a workshop titled "Beyond Gotcha," substantive accountability in public discourse, highlighting Crockett's methodical approach to examining authority. The exchange became a reference point for teaching interviewing techniques that emphasized evidence over theatrics. Perhaps the most significant impact was on public understanding of constitutional debate. Polls conducted weeks after the segment found that 68% of Americans who had seen it expressed interest in learning more about the consistent application of constitutional principles across political divides. Media analyst David Chen remarked, "For decades, legal commentators were evaluated primarily on credentials and persuasiveness. Representative Crockett demonstrated that consistency over time is an equally important measure of credibility." 6 months later, the influence of the exchange continued to reverberate. Law schools reported heightened interest in courses examining the history of constitutional interpretation. Prominent commentators increasingly addressed the evolution of their views and highlighted principles that remained consistent. During the confirmation hearings for a new Supreme Court justice, senators from both parties began asking nominees about consistency and constitutional interpretation. One senator explicitly referenced the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange, asking, "How can Americans trust that your constitutional interpretations are based on consistent principles rather than preferred outcomes? What safeguards do you personally employ to ensure consistency?" The confrontation had transcended viral television. It catalyzed a subtle but profound shift in the evaluation of legal expertise in America. In an era of deep political polarization, it provided a template for principled disagreement, showing that rigorous accountability could elevate public discourse rather than degrade it. Textbooks in legal education began including the exchange as a case study in ethics. One widely used casebook introduced a chapter titled "Consistency Across Political Divides: The Ethical Responsibility of Legal Commentators," analyzing how Crockett's methodical approach exposed important questions about advocacy and impartiality for law students, commentators, and citizens navigating complex information environments. The exchange provided a lasting reminder. The most persuasive challenge to inconsistent authority is not matching rhetoric with rhetoric, but meeting contradictions with evidence, responding to selective interpretation with calm insistence on principle. As the next election cycle approached with its predictable constitutional controversies and competing legal interpretations, the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange remained a reference point proof that accountability didn't require personal attacks or partisan framing, only clear-eyed commitment to consistency and evidence. If anything, the moment underscored a broader lesson for American civic life. Real media literacy develops not through partisan point scoring, but through understanding the importance of consistent principles and holding even the most established authorities accountable to their own words. Millions had watched, learned, and shared. The ripple effect on legal education, journalism, and public discourse would be felt for years. Crockett's calm, meticulous approach had transformed a routine legal debate into a defining moment of accountability. Dershowitz's silence, at once astonishing and revealing, reminded viewers that no reputation, no matter how storied, is immune from scrutiny when consistency is demanded. It was a masterclass in holding power to its own standards, demonstrating that evidence and principle could prevail over authority and theatrics.